Hello, everyone, and welcome to. Uh, sí, okay, she woke up.
Okay.
To an episode of the Iron Codex Chronicles. I guess we can label it as that because it's the very first time we're doing like a live interview. I'm here with Santiago from Cuarto de Guerra. Hola, Santiago, ¿cómo estás?
Hello, hola a todos. Thank you for having me, Tony.
Yes.
It's a pleasure and an honor that you invited me to co-host this special episode with you.
Yeah, I mean, you're the leading expert in RPGs in Cuarto de Guerra, so I figured you were the best
Oh,
fit as a co-host. And we also have two very, very special guests today, Matt Goetz and Faye Reppas from Privateer Press. Hello, guys. Thanks
Hello, it's a
for
pleasure
being
to be
here.
here.
Hello, yeah.
Yes, thank you very, very much for being here. I guess that everyone watching on Twitch or on YouTube already knows who you are, but just in case, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what are your roles in the Requiem team?
Of course. Faye, do you want to go first?
Sure. Faye Reppas. I work at Privateer. I work on, I don't know, all the games at once. But I mostly run Mompoc and War Machine right now. I also answer questions for Riot Quest, and then of course, whenever Getz needs me, I write for the Aki RPG. It's always fun.
And I'm Matt Goetz. I'm the role-playing game development manager at Privateer. Had a large hand in bringing Iron Kingdom's Requiem to life with some very talented folks, and have been working diligently on Borderlands and Beyond for some time now with yet another group of talented folks.
Yes, we have been reading all the insiders about all the guests, writers you have for this Kickstarter.
Oh
Speaking
yeah,
of
they're
Kickstarter, I'm going to be posting the links to the current Kickstarter, that's Borderlands and Beyond, on chat for everyone who hasn't backed yet, because I think there is still time for the early bird, right?
Yeah, I think that you're down to the wire on the early bird at this point. I think it's your last opportunity to get in there and grab that level of pledge.
Okay, so everyone who is in the fence about backing, just go ahead, back, and then come back to the stream. Anyway, the stream is going to be just audio, so you can back while you listen, so you're not going to miss much.
Yeah, no, you can open it up in another tab. I promise I'll be here.
Yep.
So, by in any measure, with only a couple of days since it was started the campaign, it's been a great success from what I've seen. Do you agree with that?
Oh yeah, I'm really pleased with how it's been doing. The first Iron Kingdom's Requiem Kickstarter just blew our expectations away. It was a fantastic crowdfunding, and I knew going into this one that you'll sometimes see fall off on like a second Kickstarter in a line, but the immediate support that we got was really encouraging. It was great to see people coming in, talking about what we were previewing, and just how we still have a lot of momentum for this second release cycle in the line.
Second of
It-
many
it,
to come,
uh,
I hope.
What's that?
Second of many to come, I hope.
Oh man, me too. Me too.
Yeah, and from what I've gathered, following the Requiem campaign, it sparked a lot of interest, not only from the War Machine and Horde fan base, but from the RPG community in general. It seems that there was a great desire to see the Iron Kingdoms back as a setting for the D&D rule set. Do you agree with that, Matt and Faye?
I do, absolutely. Like, if you go back to the roots of the Iron Kingdoms, it started with 3.0,
Yeah.
the third edition of the game, and it lived in that space for a while until I think just around when 4th edition came out is when it was no longer supported through the OGL model. With 5th edition, and I just in general want to say I think 5th edition is a very, very clean version of the game that allows for a lot of flexibility, a lot of adaptability, and it makes it much easier on people like Faye and myself to have that kind of system to build on top of.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think that 5e is just it's a really nice system that is very streamlined for people that haven't played an RPG before, but haven't like really gotten in depth. Maybe they've done it once or twice, but like it's just it's so much easier to understand what you're doing as a player, and more importantly, to run it as a DM. Because running things as a DM is not easy, and memorizing like Pathfinder rules is it's a lot of work. You know, I mean, I've done it. I've ran 3.5 Pathfinder, you know, but there's so many more things to memorize in that world.
I mean, my favorite...
One thing that I really like...
Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I was just going to say, one thing I really like about 5th edition too is where in some previous editions you would have a lot of buried or hidden bonuses, like when you're under these circumstances you get a plus whatever to this particular action. The tactile nature of advantage and disadvantage makes it a lot more immediate as a player experience, and it's a lot easier for the game master to adjudicate do you have advantage or disadvantage on this action, and it just keeps the flow of the game moving so much more easily.
I was going to say that my favorite RPG system is Cypher system. That's way more simpler than D&D, and I was always on the fence on playing mastering D&D because it felt too crunchy for me. But the Requiem was the final thing that pushed me to, okay, I have the setting here now. I must play D&D on the setting because the Iron Kingdoms is one of my favorite settings. So I have everything converted already for me. So I just started playing.
Nice, that's great.
Yeah.
But not only what Matt said that about the intuitive nature of the 5e rule set being much more accessible than previous editions, but as it was previously stated, the Iron Kingdoms have a pretty tight history with the D&D rule set. Maybe not many know this or remember, but like Matt said, the Iron Kingdom started with the adventures for the 3.0 rule set, and not only that, if memory serves me well, the first adventure of the Witchfire trilogy was one of the first adventures, third-party adventures released in the early days of 3.0.
Yeah,
am I right?
Yeah, I believe so. I think that Green Ronin's campaign setting, Freeport, came out at around the same time. So I'm not sure if Witchfire trilogy or the Freeport setting came out first, but they were both right on the heels of 3rd edition releasing.
They both were released at Gen Con, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, I think you're right. Yeah.
There's also the urban legend that Wizards of the Coast have made a contest to choose a new setting, and Eberron and Iron Kingdoms were the two that were in the finals, and Eberron won, and Matt Wilson put a vendor and said
no, that's an urban legend.
That's an urban legend. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
that's a little bit before my time, if I'm going to be honest, but I could ask him and find out.
Okay, back to the actual interview, so we don't pile up on Matt and Faye. So
a quick review of the Kickstarter says that, like in the previous ones, we're going to have 3 books. The Borderlands and Beyond, that's going to be the player book. the survival guide, that's going to be a book for the DM, and the Shadow of the Seeker as the adventure, similar to the Witchfire adventure on the previous Kickstarter, an additional adventure about the Cephalix escape the manslavers. So,
Yes.
and it's okay. So, Santi, do you want to go with the first question then?
Okay, so we see this format of a 3-book release for the Kickstarter, the second Kickstarter campaign, and it seems that it did pretty well with the Requiem Kickstarter, and it seems to be doing great with the current Kickstarter with almost 2 weeks yet to go. Is this a format for possible future Kickstarter campaign that you plan, or the Privateer Press plans on doing?
So, my initial answer is yes. Like, the way that this has been composed is typically you have a more player-facing, a more game master-facing, and an adventure book that sort of covers all of the bases of what you need in a single package. I will say that what those books are might change around a little bit, right? So to give you an example, the Borderlands Survival Guide does have monsters in it, but it is not just the Monsternomicon again. It has a lot of other options as well. And maybe in the future, if we did another 3-book release like this, the adventure book might not be just a single story, but rather it could be a collection of shorter stories themed around whatever the theme of that particular Kickstarter happened to be. So, and this is me just throwing something out there. I'm not planning for the next one to be a Signar Kickstarter, but if it were, we could do an adventure book that had an adventure in Caspia, and one in Highgate, and one in Ironhead Station or something, right? Like, I feel at liberty to move the pieces around and reevaluate what goes into each of these individual books, so long as we present a complete and satisfying package with them.
And speaking
that would be awesome.
Yep. Speaking of the future and packets, and knowing that Orgoth are coming to War Machine and Hordes, are there any plans to making like a Kickstarter that's all about the Orgoth return to tie into War Machine, or the development of both the Requiem and War Machine are two separate things that not necessarily have points in common?
Well, it's an interesting question, because both War Machine and the Requiem RPG setting, like, they're the same world, right? They have to inform each other. But if we're shining a spotlight in War Machine on something like the Orgoth, obviously those are going to have an impact on the RPG, but we don't want to shine the spotlight on the same thing over and over again. So if War Machine is focusing on the Orgoth, we might use that opportunity to turn the spotlight away from them slightly to highlight some other nearby and related thing that is impacted by the Orgoth. That's not to say we wouldn't make rules for Orgoth conquerors or their strange Warjack equivalents or whatever. It's just basically don't want to be repeating the same material over and over for people, if that makes sense.
At least not at the same time, maybe in the future.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Not at the same time. We want to make sure that there's a diversity of content and perspectives into the Iron Kingdom setting, depending on what it is you're playing with.
I mean, in the Orgoth invasion is going to be, epic. So obviously, everywhere is going to feel some of its effects. So, you won't ever be able to completely get away from, and we don't want to completely get away from, current events, because current events are important. But, yeah. Not
it's
just
sort of
saying, let's do an Orgoth. 3 books about Orgoth is probably not a great idea.
Well, it's sort of like Requiem itself, right? It could have taken the role of, okay, this is going down during the claiming, when the Infernals came, but that's just Oblivion again. And it was a lot more interesting for us to kind of turn the clock forward slightly so we could feel the impact of Oblivion and sort of the fallout of those events and how it reshaped the world and people's lives.
Also, just something like Oblivion is so, like, world-ending and dangerous that there's just kind of no way to tell a story that doesn't constantly involve the Infernals, because just literally every country was under attack at the same time. It wasn't like an invasion where there's a place where the invasion is happening. No, it was a, I don't know, dimensional invasion. So it happened everywhere at once. So there's kind of only one story we can tell at that point. So it's very difficult to tell anything else happening in the claiming.
Right. It will be too much of a good thing for saying something to have two events as impactful as the Orgoth invasion and the Oblivion happening at once in in publishing times, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Santi, do you want to ask the next question?
But yeah, sure. Okay, so maybe I go. If you don't mind, maybe we could go a bit into some of the mechanical aspects of what may be included in the Borderlands and Beyond
Absolutely.
books. Okay,
I'd love to.
so we've already seen some previews about the Warlock and how it differs from the OGL Warlock, or at least, and how you will address that difference. As well as some barbarian paths like the long riders and the rune shapers. So
yes, let me just say, I would have never guessed that rune shapers were going to be a barbarian subclass of all things.
yes.
Obviously, it was a sorcerer or a wizard and a barbarian. Like, I'm going to throw rocks at you until you die, and if you don't, I'm going to walk on you and punch you in the face.
It's a very Trollkin way of life,
Yeah.
right? And you have Faye to thank for that particular barbarian path. That was all her.
Yeah, I was thinking about how rune shapers come into existence, and I realized that, like, they're not sorcerers, right? And they're not any of the new classes we made. They're not shamans. They're not warlocks. They're not any of those things. They really do kind of combine ferocious combat and magic, and that's really what the rune shaper does. It's a very kind of like the magic is built into the combat, which is, I think, pretty interesting. Not something that's been done a ton. Well, obviously, barbarian spellcasting is something that's never been done because usually barbarians can't cast spells. So.
You've announced that there will be quite a lot of new subclasses options for the existing classic. If I remember correctly, you said about 25 new subclasses.
Yeah, that sounds correct.
Okay. Will some of those be for the classes that were introduced in the Requiem book, or are all those for the OGL classes, new classes that are introduced in Borderlands and Beyond?
So each of the new classes in Borderlands has its own subclasses. That's just part of the structure and design of a 5e class. But for the 25 subclasses that we put in, it's a mixture of OGL stuff, like your fighters and your clerics, and some of the Requiem things, like the mechanic class. There's at least 2 new mechanic subclasses for the Iosin and Rulic cultures, and that's pretty much true across the board of the subclasses. We where it makes sense, we add something to either an OGL class or one of the ones that we introduced in Requiem.
Yeah, assuming it differs enough, right? The like the Rulic Warcaster is kind of similar to a controller caster, right? The caster that focuses on warjacks, but it's different enough that we were able to find a good path there. But if we come to the point where I'm not sure there's a Kadoran Warcaster, there might be.
There might be. I could think of a couple of angles there, but some of those would also be just a multi-class, right?
Yeah, that could be too. Yeah, you 3 classes of fighter, and then jump into
the butcher is 19 levels of barbarian and 1 of warcaster.
Pretty much. But yeah, like there are definitely reasons that we chose to do things as subclasses from either of those 2 sources, OGL or Requiem. In the case of the Rulic Warcaster and our different varieties of Iosan Warcasters in the book, not only do they play differently, and do they have kind of different cultural assumptions going into their military training and everything, but on a more pragmatic standpoint, they have very different jacks. The Myrmidons and Rulic Steamjacks feel different and function differently, and we wanted to create subclasses that allowed you to sort of capitalize on those differences.
Okay. And speaking of all those classes and subclasses and warjacks, everything that we're going to see in this book has an equivalent in the War Machine and Horse game, or are there going to be stuff that is new and unique to this book?
Oh, definitely the second one.
Okay.
It's not going to be every single Steamjack or War Beast is all brand new. There's going to be a lot of familiar material in there, but there are things that just have no equivalents in War Machine or Hordes.
A lot of the Pharaoh War Beasts.
Yeah.
Especially because, this version of Pharaoh is not focusing on the monstrosities that Dr. Arcadius makes.
Yeah, these are just the Pharaoh people out there.
Yeah.
The Devourer resonance for the Warlocks, we didn't completely build them from the ground up. Did they still have Argus, Faye, do you remember?
Yeah, Argus and Gorax are still on their list.
But they also have Spine Rippers and Widow Bears and Thornwood Maulers, things that are not available to your Circle Ouroboros players, that are still, like, logically make sense as being a part of that Devourer resonance.
Okay, and since you brought up what kind of beast will be available in this campaign, will those beasts that are available for the players be as sort of predefined beast? So if we take the equivalent of the horse games, such a troll axe or a stalker, or do you get a generic light beast or generic heavy beast that you then modify like you did with the Warcaster in Requiem?
Faye, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so there's nothing stopping you from handing a war beast a weapon, right? You can do that. We don't specifically call it out as an option, but we also very specifically leave it open, right? There's a weapon customization part in the GM toolkit book, and I specifically call out making war beast weapons. So you can make them and you can hand them to your war beast, and the war beast can use them, assuming they have hands. But we don't specifically call out any equipment for the war beast, because the war beasts are generally going to be strong enough without that equipment.
And it comes.
Oh god.
Oh, I was going to say, if I can expand on that, in Borderlands and Beyond, your Trollblood Warlock is not going to go down to the market and pick up a Troll Impaler. That's not how it functions. It's more you you bond with one of these trolls, and you have a hand in shaping what it does with you. There are parameters there, but you bond with a troll, or you bond with an Argus, and what that troll or Argus ends up being is really more up to you, the warlock, than as prescribed and predefined as it is in the tabletop wargame.
And I guess when you say weapons, you also mean armor and other kind of equipment, right? If I want to forge a full plate for my troll beast, I can do that.
Yeah, it would follow the same rules as putting full plate on, your Ogren character, for instance. I think that there's some guidance elsewhere for oversized weapons, like in the core D&D books, guidance for oversized weapons and the costs of large and larger armors. So it's something that we didn't necessarily have to point out directly ourselves.
Yeah. And one thing that you're probably going to immediately have a little bit of a hard time doing is being sure that the armors don't stack too high, because you're not really supposed to stack natural armor and really heavy armors entirely, but those rules are never completely defined in 5e. So, it's ultimately up to your GM how they want you to stack those things, and you should listen to them, because they're in charge.
Rule of thumb is the AC is over 25, you are not doing it right.
Yeah. If you can hit anything over 18 at level 1, you're not playing 5e correctly.
Yeah. On the other hand, if you need a shield for a troll war beast, you can just go to your local train station and just pick up the front lead of a locomotive, right? The circular door.
The cattle guard on the front.
Yeah, just read that off. Put a little bit of leather so the war beast can hold it, and you're set.
Yeah, I do suggest that if anybody wants to make equipment for their war beasts, they use those customization rules, because it makes the item cost a lot more. And you know what? A war beast with a shield is actually really, really strong. So, it should probably cost the equivalent of what a magic item would cost. So, just be aware what you're doing, and don't make the argument that your natural armor of 15 should stack with your full plate and should also stack with this shield, because that's not a good argument.
I mean, it won't. I can just categorically say it won't.
And since we're speaking of broken combos, when you were developing and plan testing this book, did you find any combos at first glance that was like too much and you have to tone down, or overall?
That's always true. That's just like a part of development in any game.
Yeah, one spell in particular comes to mind.
One spell in particular? Was it one of mine?
It was Affliction.
Sure.
Affliction kind of made there be a minimum damage that you could do to something, and that minimum damage was set a little too high. So then we just had to drop it down, and then it was fine.
But yeah, that's there are a lot of moving pieces in a role-playing game that when you're developing it, you might not immediately spot. There are abilities that interact with items, that interact with certain target types, that interact with feats. It's just it's a complex machine, and there are definitely going to be combinations that go out into the world that are tuned higher than we expected because of how they interact with other things that we just didn't have the manpower or time to iterate on, to make sure that we didn't let some affliction out into the wild without bringing it back down. That's one of the reasons we show the PDFs off early, is because all of the eyes of all of the backers find stuff that you've glossed over weeks and months of reading this same material over and over again.
Yeah. It definitely, that's one thing that is not so glaringly obvious about the creative process, but once you've read the same thing, like 3 times, you just don't catch errors anymore. And it's not great, but it's kind of true,
As a programmer, I can sympathize with that.
Yeah.
I've considered the rubber duck, the programmer's rubber duck, to yell at when I'm going through particularly sticky rules.
Yeah, I don't have the rubber duck. I just let the compiler say what is not working, and I introduce mistakes on purpose to see if I'm reading right or if I'm doing something wrong. Anyway, Santi, do you want to ask the next question, please?
Yes, I was going to ask that since you brought up the subject of going through the documents and looking for the player's input, do I gather that this time there will be again a round of public feedback from the backers, like there was from the Requiem campaign before sending the final PDFs?
Yes, that is our plan. But no
It'll
plan survives first contact. As you thought, right?
Yeah, probably be a pretty short window, but there will definitely be a good window there where we can collect feedback.
Yeah, I saw that there were already comments in the campaign updates that were pointing out some formatting errors and so on. So people are really eager to to go through that again.
Yeah, I mean those pages that we show off on the campaign are pages that we laid out specifically to show out for the campaign, right? They're not necessarily the finished laid out product.
Yeah, but people are really starved for more spoilers and content. It's really apparent.
Well,
and so
we do have more coming.
Awesome. So going back to the beast side that we were talking about, and since you were bringing up the possible pitfalls of equipping a war beast and to that, were they difficult to take into account when designing encounters for adventures? What advices can you give to GMs that may have to go through those steps?
So a lot of it does come down to your players and how they interact with your games. You'll find that in every group there are players who can think in unorthodox ways, circumvent what you thought your plan could possibly have been. So when you're developing encounters, I really, for my own personal games, not ones that I'm writing and producing, for those, I try to give a range and let people play with those numbers at their own table. But when I'm designing encounters for myself and for my friends and family, I tend to be a little bit looser. I'll create a few combinations that are at around a medium to hard difficulty level. I prefer things to be on the slightly harder side encounter-wise, and I'll tune on the fly as I'm playing to make sure that there's still a challenge present, but it's not an overwhelming challenge.
Yeah, the second wave of combat.
Oh,
all right,
the
you
monster
guys.
Closet.
Yeah.
The monster closet is genius. Anytime you have an encounter that you're still feeling out how your players' characters are interacting and their capabilities, just slap a door somewhere in the room. If you need more monsters, that door leads to the backup garrison or a watch post. If you don't need more monsters, it's the broom closet. It's just it's a card to keep in your back pocket. The monster closet is something I learned from a dear friend and mentor of mine.
For reading Narnia, that you have a closet that actually leads to a place full of monsters, or it can be a regular wardrobe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that sort of improvisational game mastering is a skill that I highly encourage people play with and adapt. Just being able to revise on the fly when your players go somewhere unexpected, do something unexpected, it'll make it a lot easier for you to present them with appropriate challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Although,
yeah, it's definitely something that I haven't personally mastered. That's why I'm not a very good DM. I've tried several times, and I'm just not the best at it, and that's okay, right? But it's interesting where if I give somebody else a bunch of really good ideas, they can implement them so much better than I can.
I'm not a really great War Machine player, so I can relate to that feeling.
Hard same.
I was going to say that sometimes it's good to have like a quote-unquote easy encounter, so the players can feel like the power they have, that they found that an encounter that a few levels before would have been hard, now it's easy. So
well, that's actually something really interesting about 5th edition too. If you look at the bonded accuracy as you move up through the tiers of play, there's that stair-stepping effect where when you get into that next tier of play, your players are actually in comparison more powerful than the creatures they should be fighting at that time. It gives you that immediacy, that hit of I am stronger now. And then it sort of balances itself back out until you hit the next tier, and then you have another stair step up. So at each one of those tiers, there's always just that little window where you get to feel more super heroic with your characters. I think that was just brilliant design.
Okay, so we've already seen in the updates in the campaign that Borderlands and Beyond will bring with its warlocks 3 resonances that define what kind of beasts a warlock bonds to and sort of their style of play, right? Okay, and this, feel free to dance around the question if you can't directly give us an answer, but it is quite conspicuous that the creatures from Everblight are absent so far, not only in what it means regarding resonances, but they weren't, if I recall correctly, any creatures of Everblight in the Monstronomicon. Is this for a reason?
I mean, everything's for a reason.
There's some Everblight stuff in the Monstronomicon. There's a section on dragons and stuff.
Well, but there's nothing specific like a rake or an afflictor, I think, is what the question is.
Oh, exactly. Some of the specific. Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah, or blighted Ogrun or blighted Niece or that kind of stuff.
Correct. So this is going to go back in the metafiction for a bit. Everblight is not in a great place right now. Following the events of the Dragon War, he didn't get the big shiny thing that he wanted. There's some strange lingering effects from the consumption of pyromalphix Othank. The twins broke away from him, ostensibly doing work that was for his benefit, but they were still able to break away for a time. And one of the twins got destroyed at the Battle of Henchhold. So it's nothing explicit. It's not like Everblight was destroyed off screen. We wouldn't do something like that. But he's used to going to ground. He hid beneath the Kingdom of Mord. He hid beneath Ios. He had a big upsurgence, but it was a relatively recent one, as recent as 606 AR. And that drew the attention of the Circle and other dragons. He made a big gambit for the Othank of Nid Orboros, and he didn't get it. Blighterghast got it instead. So rather than keep himself overextended, it made sense for us to have Everblight kind of go to ground and strategize what his next moves are going to be, which is why you're not seeing as much of the Legion of Everblight Dragon Spawn represented in the Monsternomicon, for instance, because they're kind of rolling back, mustering, and planning their next steps.
And
Okay.
if the request timeline is anything to say, he put up a factory somewhere and is making robots now.
Yeah, the Riot Quest timeline is not something to go off of. It is a fun timeline, very fun.
And what about Scorn? Can you tell us anything about them? Because in the Henchhold Scrolls, there were some business between the Iosen and the Scorn people, and we haven't seen much of them in the Requiem books yet.
Yeah, I believe in the setting chapter for Requiem, we mentioned how the Scorn are not in Western Immorin now.
Mm-hmm.
Something happened. There was some sort of fracture in their admittedly pretty tenuous alliance, and the Scorn were driven out by the Iosans. And I don't want to get too much deeper into the hows and whys of that going down, because that is covered in the setting chapter of Borderlands and Beyond. But needless to say, after things with the Infernals started to go down to a low simmer, the Scorn and the Iosans were back at one another, and the Iosans came out the victors of that particular engagement.
I mean, they were back at each other even before the Infernals were done. But yeah, things are not going great with the Scorn in Western Immorin.
So what you're saying is that Gorshay and Hexeris did not get married and form a family and
No.
happily after. Okay.
Well, I
No,
mean,
this is not a happy ever after story.
if we can have a Riot Quest timeline, we can also hold out hope for a Gorshade Hexeris timeline somewhere out there, and maybe Haley is watching down on them from her place in the time stream.
Infinite Haleys. It's
Infinite
obviously infinite Haleys.
Okay.
Yeah.
You hear it here first, folks. The next dual character in Riot Quest is Hexeris and Gorshay happily ever after.
Would it be Gorhex or Hexshade?
Hexshade sounds more meta, so I go with that.
Okay.
And then speaking of combining things, in the Requiem, they said that any race could be a warcaster, and here in the previews for warlocks, it says that usually someone with a attunement to trollbloods, to trollbeasts is a troll, but any race can be a warlock with a troll attunement. Is there going to be any restriction saying that a character can or be a warcaster and a warlock at the same time, or like the Felcorer says in the Requiem that all Felcorers are trollbloods, but if you want to make a governed Felcorer, you can also do it? It's going to be like hard rules, or usually this happens, but if you have a cool concept, go for it.
So it's definitely going to be usually this happens. We just want to take the shackles off, honestly, and let people play the game that they want to play. We present the information as in the world of the Iron Kingdoms, this is how things are. But that should by no means tell you that you can't have it the way you want it to be. And there are actually a lot of in-setting precedents for that kind of thing, too. Like, for instance, when it comes to the Trollbloods and a non-Trollkin being able to bond with trolls and command them as a warlock, the Kolgot Oath isn't just like a secret handshake. There's a more metaphysical, more mystical level to that connection. And there was even a previous League version of Leto where he was a Trollblood warlock. So we looked at that and we said, you know what? No, that's cool. We'll codify that as something that usually Trollblood Warlocks or Trollkin. However, there are ways for other people to be them as well. And that's true across the board. Like,
so
we want
Meyer can take swamp trolls, for example, in the war game.
Yeah, absolutely. And Arcadius is a human. He had to study the Pharaoh and their beasts quite a bit and do some modification to them, but he is a Pharaoh resonance warlock.
Well, and Dahlia that controls Tasselworm because why not?
But she has the flute, right? The special flute. But if you look at it with the rules that we're presenting in Borderlands and Beyond, Brun and Lug. Brun could pretty much be a Rulic Devourer Resonance Warlock.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing stopping you from saying the Widow Bear is actually a grizzly bear, right? Or a polar bear. Do as you please.
And, warlocks have shown strange bonds to things outside their normal limitations in the past as well. I was thinking about how Borka has a deep, not to the same level as like a warlock warbeast bond, but he has a deep bond to his Mount Arctus. And I mean, Morta Theurgy allows the Scorn to sidestep a lot of the resonance questions, but you have Surus, the giant rhino mount, that in fiction has been commanded by mental prods of Xerxes. So it's us looking at all of those different bits of lore and also knowing that we want people to be able to play the game in a way that makes them happy and not trying to impose authorial will down on people's home games.
And there's also, something to be said for an atypical character having an atypical resonance. A human with a Trollblood resonance really does imply that particular human had a very interesting upbringing, right? And it could become, important to the storyline, which is always fun.
Was this pursuit of giving players freedom to create the characters that they want to play that led to the creation of the resonance and essence rules? Because I found those really interesting in that they add another layer to the character that allows to create so many more different and varied characters than you could only do with the class and background combination. Who came up with that?
That was pretty much the whole team on Requiem. So in the second edition, we had the archetypes for gifted, mighty, agile, intellectual. And we knew that we wanted to preserve something about that because we felt that it really helped people to create Iron Kingdom's characters. But it also served us a purpose in that it gave us the opportunity to decouple ability score modifiers from a character's race. Like, that sort of bioessentialism was something that we looked at and we're like, okay, it's how rules are presented in 5th edition, but we want to provide people with an option not to do that. If you want to have a stronger than average elf, we want you to be able to do that. And that led us into having the essence and the background sort of take the place of those +2, +1 ability score modifiers, depending on what combinations of them you put together.
And with this line of thinking, you got ahead of what Wizards of the Coast eventually did with racial bonuses or lineage bonuses, as they call now.
I think they were just beginning to put out into the world that they were considering those kinds of changes when we were developing that system.
Yeah. I remember it being being in the discussion was like, yeah, they're kind of already talking about this, so it even makes kind of more sense that we can go in this direction.
Exactly.
And speaking of essences, is there going to be any new essences in this book, or just the ones in Requiem?
There are no new essences in this one, but that doesn't mean that there isn't room for new essences in the game.
Thankfully, the gifted essence in particular is so open that it works really well with every single caster type, which was good. Now working on warlocks and shamans and realizing, oh sweet, yes, we've already got the right essence for the job.
Yeah. It was in the initial kind of brainstorming a consideration. Do we do a wild essence? But, or, I mean, wild or ancient or whatever the essence could have been, right? But that implies a kind of distancing between humanity and the stuff that we presented in Requiem, stuff we're presenting now. I didn't want us to really drive a wedge between them, because we're all just people of different cultures, right? It would have to be something that had like a truly major undercurrent for a new essence to really feel appropriate. So going back to the Legion of Everblight, for instance, we could do something like a blighted essence, because that is an umbrella that encompasses everybody within Everblight's legions. And they are actually different physiologically and psychologically and spiritually different from other people in other areas because of their blighted nature.
Yeah, I could even see a blighted essence for each of the 3 big blights that are still out in the world. Well, I guess 2.5.
So speaking of the way that the game is changing and into the future, we recently heard, it's been announced that in 2024 there will be a sort of revision, but quite not new edition of the 5e rule system. Do you think that it will affect in any way the Requiem line? Will you as a third-party creator get an advance as a preview to tamper with, to adjust your planning?
So it's a little difficult to speculate about, right? Like, I saw the updates that they'd been talking about. They were all very interesting. Some of it's streamlining, some of it's basically codifying what they've already kind of soft launched in some of their more recent products. But unless I know what that looks like within the license of the OGL, and if those changes are compatible with the layer of changes that we've already done, I can't really answer that question because I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, if they're going to start talking to content creators, they probably won't do it for another, at least probably year. I'm not convinced that if it's relatively minor streamlining changes, they'll talk to content creators significantly more. Because those kind of changes will probably work seamlessly, but it all comes down to what they end up really deciding to do. Is this the difference between 3 and 3.5, or is this the difference between 3.5 and Pathfinder? We'll have to wait and see.
Awesome.
Okay, so to sum up, it's too much in the future to be worried about now.
At least a little bit. It's not like massively in the future, but yeah, probably. Right this minute, we're probably okay.
Yeah, and like, if I were to speculate what those changes would be, I would just be making it up in some instances.
Yeah.
But also, the addition of the game that we have right now works very well with what we're doing with it. And if we can't or decide not to follow after those changes, it in no way diminishes people's ability to play with the game they already have, right? Like,
exactly.
those rules are still effective. They're still working. And we're making the changes in things like Borderlands and Requiem that we feel are necessary to play in Iron Kingdom's 5e game.
Yes, yes. I've seen in the not only in the Requiem rules but the Borderlands and Beyond previews, there are rules that sort of into what would be the Iron Kingdom's properly speaking terrain. Rules that reflect things that you can see in the tabletop game, for example, and it's quite cool. It's awesome to see that sort of engineer that you're doing with.
I think we lost Santiago.
Oh, we lost him?
Oh,
No.
okay.
There you go.
Hola, hola.
Yeah, not you're
You're
there.
back.
Oh.
We just missed the last part of your sentence.
I was saying that it can be seen in the design work that you're doing in Requiem and Borderlands and Beyond, how you try to incorporate aspects of the Iron Kingdom settings and even the tabletop game rules wise, and it's really cool to see that.
Thank you. Yeah, and there's some great stuff in the Borderlands Survival Guide that show you kind of how we're using the framework of 5e, but we're not always restricting ourselves to it. So in the OGL rules, there's rules for madness, people who suffer mental strain and have afflictions because of that. Borderlands Survival Guide has stress rules that are similar, but they function very differently. They have different outcomes, different triggers and effects, because it felt more appropriate to the fiction and the stories of the Iron Kingdoms itself. So there are some areas where it may look like we're reproducing rules out of the OGL, but we're actually rebuilding around those concepts.
I mean, in general, the Iron Kingdom's world is a little bit more risky, right? You know, you can't cure diseases nearly as easy, especially like blight, right? You just can't cure blight. You either resist it or you become blighted, right? It's one or the other.
I for one accept our Dragon Overlord. I mean, yes, continue.
So, you know, having alternate rules available that bring things like poisons, diseases, and insanity into more context, if the GM wants to do that, is really important. But you know what? Not everybody's going to want to do that, and a lot of people are going to want diseases to just go away when they cast Lesser Restoration.
Right, absolutely. And that's why it's the first, I'd say, chapter and a half of the Borderlands Survival Guide are optional and variant rules, things that you as a game master and your players can sit down and talk about and figure out that we want to use these more punishing healing rules that harken back to the 3-5 days, or yeah, we want this new resource tracking mechanic for our Steam Jacks because it's simpler, right? It's a la carte. People can come up to the buffet, take what they want from it, and bring it back to their own table. But we don't feel that anybody is obligated to take everything that we've got on offer in the survival guide in particular.
Awesome.
And since you're talking about pure D&D and Requiem as two similar yet distinct games, have you had the opportunity of see the reaction of D&D players that have never seen the setting coming into Requiem and react to that, as opposed to War Machine players that know what to expect of the Iron Kingdom setting?
I have not, but I also live far away from any urban centers and am incredibly paranoid about catching and passing on COVID. So I've been doing most of my gaming via virtual tabletops with my established crew. So pretty much every one of them who knows me knows the Iron Kingdoms at this point.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely true for me too, right? The first physical game of War Machine that I've played in the last, I don't know, year, and I've played tons of War Machine in the last year, was literally earlier today. We all got together and play tested at Privateer Press headquarters. And, we just haven't needed it because we've had other avenues that work better and are safer. But coming together every once in a while, especially when we're testing something new and interesting like Orgoth, is very important sometimes.
So if you're
I for one, I can.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go. No, I was going to say that I for one can say that in my limited experience, the coming back of the Iron Kingdoms to D&D rule set has sparked interest in people in D&D players that aren't War Machine and Horse players. In one of the groups that I play, two of the players that aren't War Machine or Horse players backed the Requiem Kickstarter, and I'm pretty sure that at least one of them will be backing Borderlands and Beyond. So, we said before, the Iron Kingdoms in itself brings something special to the D&D experience, and it's awesome that it's coming back.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, right? Like, when we were still going to conventions and running demos for people, there were shows like Gen Con where I had an open table that people could drop in and play the second edition IKRPG. And we're talking about Gen Con. If you're at Gen Con, you know D&D at some level, right? Mm-hmm. And you'd see these people get in and start playing, and they would really be taken aback by how things in the Iron Kingdoms felt familiar, but had their very own take on stuff. Like, Cyclopses in the Iron Kingdoms are not the same as you would see in other more standard D&D. Same with trolls and griffins and all of that, right? It definitely has its own unique character that catches the interest of a lot of people, and I really like that about it.
I mean, I really want to see somebody that's never seen a warlock or the concept of a warlock read the class from start to finish, and the Warby section, because they kind of go hand in hand, and really see what kind of immediately jumps out at them. When I was writing the introduction to the warlock class, I tried to write to that person, but it's been so long since I've met that person, because I'm so, directly involved with the community, that it took me a little while to realize, I need to be talking to the D&D audience, not to the War Machine audience.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So, Tony, do you think it's a good time to go on with the questions regarding the future?
Yes, yeah. So we can start. Just one quick question about this Borderlands and Beyond. Is there going to be any options for the human warsharks, like we have already seen on Requiem, like Signal warsharks or Cader warsharks or that kind of stuff, or is just going to be all for the role and the Iosans?
We really wanted to focus our attention on the Myrmidons and Relic Jacks this time around, especially the Myrmidons, because it didn't have the same examination in the previous edition that the Human Jacks did. So we definitely wanted to focus our efforts this time on the Jacks of those two particular nations.
So, a lot easier to kind of build your own Jack for human Jacks, except for Cadoran Jacks, because they feel a lot different. But most of the other human factions can really kind of work off the same skeleton. Whereas Relic Jacks, There's obviously the gun bunny Jack, right? So that's a very different Jack than anything we've really seen before. And then for Myrmidon's sky's the limit. There's tons of things we need to talk about there. So.
Okay, so is there anything else that you can tell us regarding content that could come along in the future outside of Kickstarter's campaign, or will be this the preferred model to bring along the setting?
It's Kickstarter campaigns are actually very useful for us as a company for those big releases, like Requiem and its companion books, and Borderlands and Beyond and its books. But I'd never say that we'd limit ourselves only to that model of releasing new content. I personally am a huge fan of smaller targeted PDF releases that, again, that a la carte kind of mentality. And I have so many documents that I've been working on between like elements proofing or waiting on a revision to come back for Borderlands, where I've just been trying to lay the groundwork for things that aren't in the plan for the next Kickstarter, wouldn't have been in the plan for this one, things that we can roll out to give people a more steady stream of content between those big Kickstarter announcements and releases.
One thing that you have already released are 2 or 3 Pendragon adventures and in the form of insiders in the Privateer Press website. Is there going to be a compilation in the future, like I don't know, every 10 or 12 Pendragon adventures, release them as a PDF or ease of access?
I wouldn't say no to that. Right now, it's really just something that we wanted to give to people so that they had more content to play in the world and examples of how to use stuff out of the Monsternomicon. But that's something we've done before, right? We compiled the old Full Metal Fridays into a single document. We took the installments of Immortality from No Quarter magazine and released them as a full book. So there's certainly a precedent there. And speaking of which, I don't know when this is going to go live, but I think we're live streaming at the moment, right?
Yes.
Because tomorrow, Friday the 15th, there's going to be a new Pendrake encounter going up on the website that ties somewhat into Borderlands and Beyond, while still using Monsternomicon content.
Nice. Actually, it's Friday here already, so chop chop.
Oh, well. Okay. October 15th at 10 a.m. 10 a.m. PST.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Okay, and now, if you don't mind, we have a couple of questions that are not Borderlands and Beyond related, but are RPG related.
Okay.
Would that be all right?
Yeah, it's fine with me.
Okay. Well, the first one is regarding the setting lore and its continuity. Since currently the fiction that was published in No Quarter and the fiction line itself are on hiatus, will be the RPG books the preferred way for Privateer Press to advance its storyline, or, as you previously stated, it will be one of the possible avenues to do so?
It's absolutely one of the possible avenues to do so. Like, one of our stated goals early on, at least internally, was we want things like the setting books and especially the adventures to always be advancing the story somewhere, somehow. And Borderlands and Beyond, man, there are some major advancements in fiction that happen there. It might not be the only way that that information comes out, but is certainly a big part of what drove us to make the choices we did to focus on the areas we did with this release.
definitely a couple of really, really important events happening in the kind of area around Borderlands and Beyond. Not necessarily like the timeline, but like as you go into iOS, a lot of mysteries come up as well as questions getting answered. Probably more questions at the end of the day than answers, but that's kind of always what we want.
Yeah, and also the opportunity to look back and make connections with things that have previously been released. Like, even before we teased that the Orgoth are coming out, when people had their hands on the PDF of Legend of the Witchfire, they learned about an agent of the Felgoeth Infernals who was still in Emerald and still acting toward those Infernal Masters' objectives. And that sort of was laying the groundwork that, hey, the Orgoths still have interest in Western Emerald. And there's stuff like that happening in Borderlands and Beyond as well.
You're gonna have the lore geeks going around like the guy from the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia meme with the with the pictures and the red line connecting every single fact from multiple books.
That's great, because if I watch them do that, it means that I'm not forced to do it myself.
This is a follow-up to that, but everything in the core books, which would be the Requiem, Borderlands and Beyond, and Survival Guide, and all that, are canon, I suppose. Are the adventures canon too? I mean, regardless of what the characters do. I mean,
yeah, the adventures happen in the world, right? Like the setups for those adventures are definitely canon. So if you're talking about like,
but let's say the in the conclusion of Witchfire, and I'm not going to spoil it. It's something important is revealed about the Witchfire. Is that canon or not? Not necessarily.
If I understand your question correctly, then yes, it is canon.
Okay.
Yeah, I think kind of the way to know what is and is not canon is that important items that are specifically talked about in a campaign, in important NPCs that are specifically talked about in a campaign, that probably ends up erring more towards canon than not. Whereas just average Joe, the street cleaner that we had to introduce because we needed somebody to get you from point A to point B, not as important.
Yes, I mean, if we go to that, like all the characters that play the adventure are necessarily not canon, because and what adventures they continue doing after they finish the pre-published adventures are also not canon. But yeah, that's
right. No,
but it's good to know that the adventure in general is canon. So if there are new important characters appearing and events that happen and are referred during that adventure, they are canon.
Yeah, and oh wow, on the 16th, so this Saturday, there's we participated in the free RPG day with an Echo in the Darkness. It takes place in Signar, and there are a couple of major War Machine characters that are referenced in it, and their current statuses is the best word for that, is also canon, right?
Okay.
Whoa.
So if you can participate in that,
calendar.
Do that. And if I recall correctly, you said that that's going to be available for backers of the Requiem Kickstarter in the future, right?
In the future, absolutely.
Definitely, anything that's talking about the setting as a general concept, that's 100% canon, right? Like, Rule has become a trade hub. That's absolutely 100% canon. There's a lot of different races that found themselves in Rule after the upheaval,
However, I will say that people will now start asking for a street cleaning on Riot Quest. So sorry, Faye. You did your own grave there.
My quest is simultaneously not canon and the best canon.
Right. Okay, and this may this is a bit more far-fetched, but are there plans to give the Warcaster Neo Mechanica setting the same RPG treatment that you're giving the Iron Kingdoms eventually?
Eventually, it's sort of like that question about the 2024 5e update. Like, who's to say? There are no immediate plans to do so, but if there's a good angle on it and a good way to bring it to an RPG setting, then maybe. But that is not within range of my radar right now.
It would also really need a lot more infrastructure than IK RPG. So.
Yeah. IK RPG, what started as an RPG.
It's very young still. Sorry, Tony.
No, I was going to say that the Iron Kingdoms started as an RPG, so they coming back as an RPG. It's you have the work already done. For Neo Mechanica, you have to start from scratch.
Yeah,
and there's some liberty to that, but
I feel like you would just need, like, a lot of the rules are just not going to work all that well. Mostly because, like, weapons in Neo Mechanica really should be just a ton more lethal than anything should ever be in 5e, right? So it's almost got to be another system. Although I say that you can do, there's other things have done, other systems have taken their core and brought them either into a modern environment or a futuristic environment and been able to figure it out and finagle and get it all to work. But it's definitely a much more deep project than taking the IK RPG and putting it in 5e. Well, that's bread and butter, whereas that is more different.
More than just that kind of mechanical consideration for me would be knowing who you are in an RPG is very important. Who your character is, what it is they're doing, and with the way that Neo Mechanica is set up, you have these never-ending waves of people coming through the portals down to the surfaces of these worlds. So a lot of it would be trying to find a biting point on who are you in this story, right? Mm-hmm. I don't imagine that the experience of playing a Warcaster floating around in deep space, controlling the flow of arc and teleporting people around is most people's favorite go-to experience. But there's a certain sense of disposability when it comes to like the Marcher soldiers and the Paladin enforcers and stuff. So it would have to be taking that part of the setting into consideration under the auspice of who are you and what are you doing?
Yeah, I think
that's
we'd
not
have
something I could answer yet.
Yeah, we'd have to choose like one world that happens to have a little bit of Marcher influence, but is primarily controlled by one of the other kind of overarching factions, but somehow has all three of the human factions kind of in the same city, and it becomes a lot more difficult. When a lot of these factions meet, they meet for war, and they're meeting on borders, as opposed to meeting in cities. So it becomes a little bit more difficult. It almost kind of feels like to just really nerd it up. Vampire Eternal
Eternal Crusade for
Jesus. Yes, thank you. I just totally destroyed my words there. Where some of the clans will work together, but a lot of them just won't. So it ends up becoming very difficult to form a party that's cohesive, that won't immediately just kill each other.
Yeah, and then you have to fit every faction in one place, and then that feels like you're trying to put what's the expression, a round peg on a square hole, or the other way around.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there's a lot of different routes that answers to that could take, but long and short to your question is, it's not currently on our radar.
Yeah.
But who knows? Maybe in 5 years we are interviewing you again because you are releasing Work as a Mechanica, the RPG.
Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe in 5 years, check in.
Nothing ever comes off the table. It's just what our table is only so large. We can only work on so many things at once. But yeah.
Anything else you want to talk about regarding Borderlands and Beyond, or the role game in general?
Yeah, actually. I have been loving seeing how people are engaging with the game and being able to be kind of a part of the community, not for any sort of like authorial statement of like, no, this is what we meant. It's just, I enjoy being able to chat about games with you guys and, you know, share those your campaign in 2 images kinds of things. It's a great pleasure for me to see people having fun in this setting with these rules, and you know, for this specific podcast, but really to everybody out there, thank you so much for letting me do this and giving me the opportunity to see you have fun with what we've been working on.
Yeah, there's literally nothing better than somebody taking something that you've made and either iterating on it or coming up with a cool way to do something with it that you just never even would have thought about. It just wouldn't have occurred to you. And that's just so it's a very nice feeling. It's a great dopamine hit.
It's why we do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we make games for people to play and have fun, and watching people have fun is absolutely one of the rewards.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you very much, Matt and Faye, for coming here tonight. Yes, tonight, depending on where your time zone is. Thank you, Santiago, for helping me put this thing together.
Not at all. Thank you, Tony. I'm delighted to have been part of this interview, and I also want to thank you, Faye and Matt, for indulging our questions and nerddom.
Of course.
Santi.
Okay, so this is me. Again, we thank you, Matt and Faye, for coming into this interview and spending time with us. And with that being said, this has been a half episode of Cuarto de Guerra. And my name is Santiago. Mi nombre es Santiago.
Mi nombre es Antonio.
Tony.
Mi nombre es Matt y esto fue un placer.
Nombre es Faye Reppas.
Awesome. And this has been Iron Codex and Cuarto de Guerra.
Guerra.